you gonna teach us anything?
What, you want me to teach you something? You want to learn something? All right. You got it!
Hello and welcome to Atomi Brainwaves. I'm your host Simon and I'm joined today by Sue. What's up, Sue?
Good morning, Simon.
I believe you're craving a bit of caffeine at the moment. Is that correct?
That's correct. Thank you for reminding me.
Yes. You're welcome. Just wanted to make sure we started on that note.
Okay. Awesome.
So, we are recording here in the studio at Atomi HQ. Atomi is an online resource for second-level education, a platform used by students and teachers alike to help make education awesome and engaging. We provide content for schools and students in Australia and the UK in the form of short, digestible, syllabus-specific videos and classroom activities. As such, ours is a podcast about education for educators, where we look at some key issues in the world of education. Today, we're doing so with the help of our resident teaching expert, former head of English, digital learning leader for curriculum and pedagogy, and director of curriculum, Sue.
Thank you.
You're very welcome. On the menu for today, we have got self-directed learning. Hot topic.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Some would say it's just teachers copping out, letting
Yes.
kids do all the
I'll
work.
argue against that during this podcast. If
looking
it's done
forward
well,
to
it
it.
is definitely not teachers copying out.
Well, let's dive into it and let's talk a bit about the student's role first. I think we'll unpack both sides, what it means for the student, what it means for the teacher, but I just want to dive first into how a self-directed student differs from, I guess, the more traditional understanding of a student.
Yeah, well, a self-directed student typically would take more ownership of their own learning. So it's less of a sort of transmission style from the teacher at the front and just sort of soaking up knowledge, or not, as depending on how much they're focused on what the teacher's saying. But it's more of actually having initiative and, directing what they want to learn, when they want to learn it to some extent.
Dictating their learning as opposed to it being dictated to them entirely.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's them sort of selecting projects, maybe being offered choice, working through what materials they think are best in order to do that. So it's almost like a choose your own adventure story for kids in the classroom.
Never loved those stories myself, but I suppose...
I always died. No matter
Oh,
what
really?
happened, I always ended
That
up
is
at like
so
page
grim.
36 and always died.
Particularly grim considering most of the stories that I did in that fashion didn't have a die option.
Oh,
so I don't know
no.
how you managed to find it.
There was a crash on a mountain one, and I always ended up crashing on the mountain.
All
Page
roads.
36, could never get off it.
Well, hopefully for most students,
Yeah, they don't.
it's
crash
not a
and
similar
burn.
metaphorical crash on the mountain for their
Self-directed
self-direction.
learning, yeah.
Yes. I guess the other key side to consider is the teacher. And there's a phrase that I particularly enjoy, the sage on the stage to the guide on the side.
Oh, yeah.
Yes, now that I've dropped that very exciting phrase, why don't you explain what it actually means?
So sage on the stage means sort of the expert on the stage, always being the one who is the sort of font of all knowledge. It's a very traditional style of teaching, made for the sort of factory model of teaching of the 18th century. Guide on the side is more what we're talking about with self-directed learning. So you are facilitating learning, you're guiding what it is that they're exploring. So it's not offering sort of just absolutely freedom of choice. They've still got to cover a syllabus, they've still got to cover the content that is required, they've still got to pass a HSC, obviously for New South Wales. But you're guiding them through elements of content. Now, a teacher's role in self-directed learning, I'd argue is well, not argue, but it's huge. So it's what you said earlier about teachers sort of copying out. I think
I was just kidding.
I know,
Just
but
kidding, I
it
swear.
is a prevailing attitude, and students as well can actually think that that's the case, and parents too. But what you don't see as much of in a self-directed classroom is the teacher influence at the forefront. But what you're not aware of, like if you sort of view it like an iceberg, the teacher has done so much behind the scenes in a really good self-directed classroom to get the students to where they are and to offer the range of activities or the range of choice that you don't see it up front in the classroom, but they've done hours and hours and hours of prep behind the scenes.
Yeah, that kind of off stage work. I
Yeah,
suppose.
like working out, and I think they get better with time, but working out exactly what modules are going to work best, what choices are going to work best, how they can best guide or steer students. And then they're also thinking on their feet a lot to, a student goes in this particular area of interest. So how are you going to support them? What have you got at your fingertips? What sort of things you've prepared in advance that you can then use to direct them down that path. So if you're going to do a kind of more free-for-all, you'd have a lot of things at your disposal to do that. If you're going to do more of a structured self-directing learning model, you'd be offering them different choices. But again, in the background, you've got all these resources at your fingertips to what choice it is that they make, as in like the choose your own adventure kind of choices. Yeah.
Yeah, and I quite like what you said there about learning as you go, right? Because if you think of that sage on the stage, old-fashioned idea, if you're just getting up and presenting the same thing, even if it's good stuff, there's very little propensity to learn from it if you're just delivering the same particular speech that you've done for the last X years.
Yeah.
Whereas if it's more interactive, if you're this guide on the side who is more exposed to how the students are responding, you can sort of develop your approach as you go.
Absolutely. And I think you get more of a partnership there. So the teacher is, from a teacher's point of view, it can bring so many possibilities. Your job is nowhere near predictable in a sort of self-directed classroom because you're supporting the students as they choose a certain thing of interest, and you can't necessarily discern what it is that's going to spark their interest. But if you're doing the sort of more factory model, one size fits all, then you're choosing their interest for them, essentially. But the self-directed model allows them to follow their areas of interest, and you follow it with them. And so there's things that, they might ask you questions and you don't actually know the answer because they've followed a path that you're... Yeah, well, no, it shouldn't,
Not really,
it shouldn't be. But you're perfectly positioned to say, I'm not sure, let's find that out together. And it's kind of that element of inquiry. And of being comfortable to be in that guide, but not the font of all knowledge in the sort of more traditional sense.
And I'd say you make some pretty interesting discoveries along the way,
yeah.
right? Like about students, about yourself, about the topic in question.
Yeah, I think you get almost more close to a student because you're sort of counselling them as you go through the different pathways that they're choosing. It's still quite a juggling act for a teacher because you can't let them go totally off topic. For example, if you're still, in an English classroom and you're doing a text, you've still got to cover that text, even if they're doing it in a self-directed way. You've still got to get to a kind of common-ish endpoint. So it's quite a juggling act to, allow them freedom, but also make sure that you are covering the syllabus.
True, but
within that
it's
freedom.
a juggling act you get better at.
The more you do it.
Very true. So let's bring the focus back to the students a little bit for a second, and I want to talk about the particular skills and abilities that a student can develop in a self-directed classroom that might not otherwise be available to them.
Well, I think a lot of schools choose at least some elements of self-directed, for say a unit or a term or some things like that, because they are fostering skills in students that will be useful for the workplace or for university. So more of the sort of soft skills or the 21st century competencies that we sort of hone to. So I think students in a self-directed mode should show more independence. They should show a greater resilience, I think, because, they've actually tested a few pathways and maybe found failure and been steered back or been, talked through with their teacher a different way of doing it. So greater resilience. I think a student would have more initiative. So they'd be able to kind of think of a, particular thing that interests them and then go from the next thing to the next thing and sort of they're the trailblazers as such. And that's a skill that you want, that's just a skill that everybody wants really, to have initiative. Employers definitely want it. And I think a student in a self-directed room would be more able to follow their passions and sort of go with their... Like they might digress, but they're following what it is that they're passionate about and learning
which is
as they do.
so important, right?
Yeah.
Because it's the things that you enjoy
Yeah.
that you are going to give the most effort to.
Absolutely.
And if you can find a way to enjoy a subject that you thought you didn't like through a new method, it's going to change the whole field of play for
definitely.
you.
And I think that's not to detract from, sometimes kids can't follow their passions. They do have to just learn this because it's part of the syllabus and it's content you need to know.
What? You're saying they
But-
can't have fun at all
But
times?
if you give them opportunities to follow their passions in some areas, then, it's like Google's 80-20 rule, or, like 20% of your time you can do work that interests you, like passion projects and that sort of stuff. And I think then you're going to have a much more motivated student, because there are times when they know that they can follow what's of interest to them in a guided way.
Yeah, they'll get through the more mundane stuff, the stuff that doesn't appeal to them, because they know that's not the entire
That's not
story.
my entire life at school,
Yeah.
So I think that adds more motivation, hopefully a sort of sense of a drive, I'd expect students to be more able to problem solve in a self-directed classroom, and even within that problem solving to actually have other people to call on. So there's a phrase I really like when teaching in a blended environment, which is 3 before me. So before you come to the teacher, have you done 3 other ways of trying to solve your problem, your question? So don't just straight away go, Miss, but have you actually maybe looked online? Have you asked a friend? 3 different ways before you get to me. And if you can't solve it before that, then definitely come to me, and I'll either be able to assist or help you to solve it. But I think that kind of problem-solving ability is really honed in a self-directed learning environment.
Because they're learning 2 things in the process, right? They're both getting the answer if they get it, but also learning different ways. You mentioned a couple there, look it up online, ask a friend. But if you're making it 3 before me, as you say, that it kind of, the student has to think outside the box a little to be like, what various ways can I go about getting this answer?
Absolutely.
So they are learning those 2 skills.
Yeah.
Well, learning the content and learning the skill simultaneously.
And I think, like, if you take a student's journey into university, they're not going to be able to just message their professor and expect an answer there and then. It doesn't work in the same way.
Oftentimes, we'll never get an answer.
You'll never get an answer, yeah. So, or you might get one several days later. So I think being able to be resourceful and having those skills taught, from way down from primary years, and then kept being revisited all the way through the senior years, is going to just help you through any sort of, further education path or into the workforce. You can't, it's the same at work. You can't just constantly be tapping your boss on the shoulder for questions. You've got to show some initiative, some sort of problem solving ability before you get to that point of, I really need help now.
Yeah, because you're right, that is the skill that is going to carry so much weight later in life.
Yeah.
Let's get technical for a minute. I want to talk about instructional design models, because obviously they're a big part of self-directed learning, the thinking around it. So could you dive into some instructional design models that a teacher can use to bring self-directed learning into their classroom?
Yeah, so I've seen and had experience with integrated curriculum units, so where a number of subjects work together to plan, a term or a year in, depends on what the school's direction is. But, looking at, say, doing English, history and science all together. And so you would not believe the amount of planning behind the scenes that is required, terms in advance to deliver something like that, to make sure that all the outcomes, all the syllabus content points are covered off, while students are then going through their self-directed, and often things like that are then provided with sort of a matrix kind of types of activities that students can choose, can delve into. Sometimes they'll be with different points, so you can add differentiation. If you've got kids who, are weaker in your class, you tell them they only need to get a certain amount of points. If you're stretching students, they would go for a higher amount of points. But they direct their learning through that matrix of activities. But then again, as a teacher, you've got to make sure that whatever path they might choose, they're still ticking off all those points of the syllabus, So
yeah, a bit of a balancing act.
Yeah, massive. Yeah. So that's kind of like an integrated curriculum one. There's massive interest in project-based learning, so where they're learning through doing a project, but that's often more covered in sort of like more hands-on subjects. Lots of there's actually like the primary years model and the middle years program, PYP and MYP, which leads on to the IB, and they focus in more on inquiry learning. So inquiry learning is huge in a lot of junior schools. And then unfortunately what seems to happen is they transition into senior school and it's either only touched on briefly or never visited again. So they've got all these skills in inquiry, and kids in sort of year 6 have got this suite of skills about being really resilient, about being able to solve problems, loads of really positive skills, and then they sort of lie dormant, I guess. I was on a training course down in Canberra last year where Kath Murdoch, who's a big guru in inquiry learning, and she was presenting to the primary schools down in Canberra. And I went as a representative of a senior school, but it was still really relevant. And I asked that exact question, what happens when they don't do inquiry units in senior school? And she said everybody in the room, because there was only 2 other high school teachers, everybody in the room would hope that those skills just lie dormant. Like they're not they're not forgotten about entirely.
Eroded away. Yeah, I see what you mean. Yeah, okay.
But they're still there. But they all found it such a shame that after years of primary schools valuing these skills and teaching them, that they're not then translated into being more valued in senior school. And I think it's the content that drives that. People are almost afraid to do kind of self-directed inquiry units, that sort of thing, because of the content. But it is possible with lots of sort of planning.
Yeah, it kind of hammers home the point that self-directed models really, it's about maintaining them over time because, the benefits are exponential. They grow the further you go down the road on a particular model or a particular style of it. So keeping it up makes such a difference, doesn't it?
And I think what's good there is if a school sort of almost hangs their hat on a model, so if you're a PYP school in the junior school, but you're not doing middle years program in the senior school, still think about where could you include elements of inquiry and have, like 1 per term, not per subject, but not, like say 1 term do an English inquiry unit, the next term do a maths inquiry unit, so that the skills are continuing rather than being just never touched, So I think it's about valuing the skills and then choosing to sort of hang your hat on a particular style that will keep those skills going. I think the difficulty for teachers is there are so many different instructional design models out there.
Yeah, it's kind of a double-edged sword, right? Because in one sense, the more choice you have, the feeling of, oh, well, I can find the right one. But then on the flip side of that, there's only so many things you can try.
Yeah.
And people can even be daunted and put off by having all of that.
And so do you do a PBL, project-based learning model, sort of design strategy for a unit, but then you might not be very good at it. So you don't do it again. Whereas if you, as a school, if you sort of say, we value project-based learning and we're going to train you up in how to deliver a unit of project-based learning for every kid, for every class, at some point in the year, then you'll get better and better at it year on year out. But I think where teachers are sort of doing it almost unsupported, just tinkering around with it, then they perhaps don't have the best experience of it. And so they think, oh, the kids went wild during that unit, I'm never doing that again, when it wasn't me leading, behaviour changed, etc. Well, behaviour is going to change because kids for the first time are exploring what it looks like to be self-directed, and they won't get better overnight. But the next time you do it, they'll understand and they'll get better each time. Yeah. So some of it is about exposure in terms of behaviour and things like that. So...
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. And I mean, one thing that I wanted to talk about, which is not at all mutually exclusive from that, is the idea of resources that kind of tie in and support certain models because, there's such an important overlap between the two things. To rely on a teacher to implement a model entirely on their own would be very difficult. But I guess what kind of resources are out there to kind of help bring self-directed learning? What should they look like? What does the right resource do?
Well, I think the best resources that teachers have are teachers themselves. So being a team of teachers, even if it's just 2 of you getting together and saying, we'd like to do a different experience for our class for this term, and being a resource, book a room that can be divided, put your 2 classes together or 5 classes together if it's across a grade or whatever. And actually be a resource for each other, divvy out what it is that you're going to create. work on who's going to deliver certain workshops, where you need to have particular periods of taught content, that sort of thing, and then create resources that the students can use. So that might look like a playlist of activities that provide the students with sort of options, sort of a path of choice through them. I mentioned earlier like a matrix card for point-based activities for differentiation. It could look like an online course that you've built in your learning management system, where things like different pathways are opened to different students in almost like a mastery paths design. So they go a certain way, they get access to different resources than if they choose a different way, and you can do that within the context of an LMS. It might be things like in your matrix card, you're plugging in other activities like here's some YouTube resources, here's some Atomi videos, here's different things that you're sort of curating together that a student can choose to look at or not choose to look at. They could find their own. But you're sort of providing them with the guide of what it is, the guide on the side.
And even if they're not looking at that, it shows them what the kind of thing they should be looking for looks like.
Yes, yeah. So it's not totally hands-off, free for all. Our topic today is the Roman Empire. Find out about it. It's not like that. It's
as much as some students might love for that to be the case.
But it's massively planned and prepped behind the scenes, and I think creating a team of teachers to do that, that's certainly the models that I've seen being most successful. Collective teacher efficacy is huge on Hattie's scale of the zone of desired effects. So being together as a team, hugely important.
Yeah, working together to bring it in, absolutely. And I mean, another thing that kind of caught my attention, so there was a story I was reading about a school called the Big Picture Academy in Illawarra. Mm-hmm. Am I saying that right?
Yeah.
I'm not a native Australian,
Me neither. I know how to say that
on
word.
This side of the world. But yes, where they've taken initiative to make students' education entirely self-directed and have done away with exams altogether. Mm-hmm. And it sort of got me thinking about, a lot of us would hear that and think that something like that is very radical. But I guess where do you think the balance should fall between a student's education being self-directed and the more kind of curriculum-based, exam-style, dictated, this is what you need to do?
Mm-hmm. I'm always going to come out somewhere in the middle, I think, with these questions.
There's nothing wrong with that.
I really like variety in teaching, and I think it's absolutely great if your school has chosen a way and that's the way that the school, the direction is going, and everybody is trained up really well in how to deliver that. You've got to get buy-in from the teachers there on more than just a sort of surface level. They've got to believe that style of pedagogy and own it as well for that to be really successful. But done well, I absolutely love self-directed learning. I think, I think it's promotes so many skills in young people and is very, very interesting as a teacher as well. But done in a haphazard way, without all that planning, without all that kind of direction, it can be a real time waster for students where they look really busy but they aren't. They're just being kept busy. They're not necessarily doing any deep learning. So I think it's really important to make sure that if you're going to go on a certain pathway, you've got enough kind of instructional time for the teachers behind the scenes to facilitate that. But I think for me, and as I think about my own child going through school, I'd love to see him being able to do a self-directed unit at least once per stage, per subject. So there's at least a history self-directed unit in stage 4. There's at least one in stage 5. And even in stage 6, there's one. And I think that's where people, it's almost like a funnel that they start very positively in junior school, in primary school, with lots of sort of self-directed or inquiry. And then as the content increases, and teachers' stress levels increase because of the HSC looming, schools become less and less self-directed the higher up the school you go, which then you get to sort of year 11 and 12, and it's pretty much sage on the stage delivery.
Which is almost ironic, considering the fact that as soon as they're out of school, it's those skills learned in primary school that will become most valuable.
Yeah, so I think it's about sort of the planning stage and teachers having the confidence in stage 6 to still do that. And one of my most successful modules of self-directed learning was with Stage 6, and I did it with a good friend of mine, Hannah Gearhart, who's the head of English now up in one of the schools in Central Coast, and her and I put together a unit on Module B, which was our Hamlet text at the time, and it was based on an academic paper that I'd read from the States, which was a university model where there was essentially a seed paper. Every student had to sow a seed about something they found interesting about Hamlet, anything at all, and they would find something that they thought, they identified with, rather than giving a one-size-fits-all question for them all to answer. And then in the lesson times, what we did was allow them time within groups, which was marked, but to explore their particular seed. And so we had questions like, I had a kid, still in contact with him, but he was mad on communism. And so he looked.
Always one.
He's actually in Russia now.
Oh, wow.
But yeah, so he was absolutely fascinated with communism. So he did his seed paper on the political landscape of Hamlet and the nature of the conflicts within the play. And he entitled it Pacifism and Violence in Hamlet. And it just was amazing what he looked at in terms of the pacifist elements of the text. Now, I would never have set that in a million years, but to see his interest still within a text was just really unique. And he learnt all of the text. He still knew it all, but through his own line of inquiry. And we had 60 students that year who did their own line of inquiry through Hamlet. And when we got the wrap package at the end of the year about their HSC results, and we analysed what was the best unit in terms of the exam paper writing, Module B was far ahead of anything else in their exam results. And it was because they actually really enjoyed that text, because we did it in a way that they discovered the text for themselves.
Yeah, they got to find their particular area of interest.
Yeah,
within it.
So we did it year in on year out, and we got better at it. To kick it off, what we then did to kick the program off is we got Bell Shakespeare in to lead a whole day of Hamlet workshops. So they actually, acted some bits of it out, and they understood, I guess, the drama side of it, and then got into the seed papers. But it was really, really interesting. And
I wish I'd been in that class.
yeah, there's stuff that I'd never seen in Hamlet, and every year I was just like, wow, this is amazing.
Always something new to find.
But that was Stage 6, Module B, lots of pressure, and still they got through everything and were able to answer really well in the HSC about that text, because in Module B, the main requirement is the text inside out, and so they did, but through their own lines of inquiry.
Yeah, that's amazing, because it's almost like three things at once. It's the skill of putting their own initiative into action. It is preparing for the exam, and it's also, dealing with loads of different aspects of the content as opposed to just learning off one or two kind of set essays.
Or in terms of just sitting as a class reading scene by scene and, explaining what that means. While they still read the text, they just read it under their terms and for their things.
Yeah, amazing. Yeah. And also shout out to you, Sue, for managing to get Hamlet in to the podcast.
Always.
Slipping it in
time.
somewhere.
If you're following at home, you can have a bingo card.
Yes. It will be full very quickly. So I guess the last main thing I wanted to ask is sort of a two-sided question. And it's this idea of, for want of a better word, selling self-directed learning to the students and getting them on side. And I wanted you to maybe talk quickly about, first of all, what teachers can do to make that happen, to get students to buy in, and second of all, how schools on a broader macro level can support their teachers in doing so.
I think so for both of them. I'm a huge believer in strategic planning. Like, I just love creating a 5-year plan for things. And when I was in the classroom or leading at a director level, having a strategic plan for, what the students are going to do or what the teachers are going to do is hugely important. So when you're trying to bring self-directed learning in, and it is a school-wide initiative, you need to inform the students and the parents why you're doing it. Same with anything. You want to blend learning, you want to flip learning, you want to do any type of learning that is different to Sage on the Stage, which parents are very familiar with. You need to actually educate the students and the parents into why you're doing it. So if you start actually sort of saying to the students, we're going to look at this different model of teaching for a term or for forever, whatever it is that you decide. And the reason is that these skills will be harnessed by this type of learning, and we value those skills in you. And you look at sort of like reports where employers are showing how much they value those sorts of skills, and there's loads of them out on Common Sense Media. But then you talk about, by learning in this way and not just relying on the teachers, you're going to be set for life. You're going to be set up with these skills for the future. And so go through that, and then actually explain what this is going to look like. It's going to look like you come into class and 24 of you are going to be doing different things. Sometimes you might come together for a workshop. Sometimes you actually might not be in your class. You might be loads of classes together if you're going to do more of an integrated grade-based model. But explain to them what the reasoning behind it is and what your behavioural expectations are of them doing it as well. And have a parent information session too. And then as you do the rollout with the teachers, work a year ahead. So you want to produce self-directed learning for 2021, then you spend in 2020 educating the teachers around what that looks like, changing whichever programs it is, and building the resources around it. I think with enough lead-in time, then you launch and then you've got everybody on the same page. Go externally, look at other schools who are doing it, like Melbourne Girls Grammar. I've got a fantastic program of self-directed learning that they started in Year 9, and they collapsed the timetable. I think it's now across 9, 10, 11, they were rolling it out year on year. But students there, they've got an academic coach, a wellness coach and a fitness coach. And they're actually from Year 9 onwards, they're allowed to ping in and out of school. They've got like a little sign-in card, and like on the Opal cards where you sort of tick yourself in and out.
I figure out what you meant by ping in and out for a second.
In and out of the campus kind of thing. And within their times that they're not being taught, they have to get on with their self-directed learning from those teaching times. But they also have to have an appointment, I think it's weekly or fortnightly, with each one of those coaches. So the academic coach sits down with them and asks them how they're doing, how they're managing their workload, what things are they working on, etc. The fitness coach is, what sessions have you booked into this term? So that it's just phenomenal what they have put together in terms of supporting that self-directed learning. But that's on a whole school level, and the timetable has been reflected, has been collapsed to reflect that. So from a planning point of view as a staff, at an executive level, it might look like reshaping the structure of the day, like they've done, to actually not have as many teaching periods, because in that, it's not free time, but in that non-teaching time, that's where your self-directed learning is going on, So I think preparation is the key to success. You've got to give teachers time and great professional learning to do it really well. And then once you've done an iteration, reflect, evaluate, and prepare for the next iteration.
And it does sound like it requires, just from those examples, which do sound really awesome, a lot of buy-in. But the more you put in, the more you get out. Obviously.
Yeah, definitely.
So if you are going to do it,
it cannot be winged. It just can't. And which is kind of like almost opposite to how people might think of it, because you're not delivering, you're not doing a great big lesson presentation, you're not doing a lecture, whatever.
That misconception that we started with.
But it cannot be winged to do it well. It has to be huge, like the iceberg metaphor. What has happened underneath the surface to get to those points of self-directed learning.
On every really level, from the top down all the way down to educating the students on the education that they're going to be getting. And what you expect. And, like I said, students will get better with each iteration of it as well. But if they've come up with the skills from the primary school, if you've got a K-12 school and they've come up with that type of learning from the primary school, you're just following it on. So start in Year 7. I wouldn't do a whole school at once, but start in Year 7, follow on from what they did in Year 6. Then those kids never lose that skill. Take that into Year 8. They've got that leg up.
So roll it out.
Page. Awesome. Alrighty, well, that wraps us up for self-directed learning. Before we go, very quickly, we're going to get Sue's hot tip for all those teachers out there. Just a little bit of advice. Can be serious, can be jokey. Doesn't even really have to have anything to do with education. Just a quick tip from Sue. So, Sue, What's today's hot tip?
It is actually based on self-directed learning today. And I just want to encourage teachers not to let the content scare you into not doing something. So don't get into the funneled response of, oh, it's year 11 and 12. I can't do it. I've got to get through so much syllabus. Like, be prepared, even in 11 and 12, to take a risk. Because when myself and my colleagues were in the years and years that we did the Hamlet seed paper, and we did it in year 11 as well, it was by far the most enjoyable time of our teaching. So don't be afraid and plan it well, but take a risk. Don't let the content scare you.
No risk, no reward. You heard it here first, teachers. Listen up. Alrighty, well, that's all we have for today. Looking forward to having you back next time for whatever crazy topic we land on in the world of education. In the meantime, check us out at getatomy.com. It's goodbye from Sue.
Goodbye.
And goodbye from me. See ya.